The ceremonial chalice lay in 100 jagged shards across the marble floor of the iron-bound pack house, the sacred wine staining the stone like a fresh wound. Pearl stared at her sister Terry, whose golden hair caught the moonlight as she pointed a trembling, accusatory finger. The accusation of poisoning the pack's well, the lifeblood of their people, rippled through the gathered wolves like a physical blow. Pearl tried to speak, but the words died in a throat constricted by a martyr's silence. She looked to the elders, seeing only the cold reflection of her own supposed guilt. In an instant, her title was stripped, her status as an Omega twisted into that of a traitor. The hunt began before the echoes of the sentence had even faded. Chased by those she once called family, Pearl ran toward the only place where the pack's scent trackers would lose her, the Forbidden Falls. The roar of the water grew to a deafening thunder, the mist rising like a ghostly shroud. At the cliff's jagged edge, she looked back one last time to see Terry's triumphant smile through the dark trees. Pearl didn't jump to her death. She vanished into the spray, her blue dress tattered as she slipped into the limestone caves behind the curtain of water. Weeks of isolation turned the soft Omega into a shadow. She survived on grit and ancient mountain lore until the night the river brought her a different kind of wreckage. Half submerged in the freezing pool was King Edward, the Alpha King of the Highlands, his golden armor caked in mud and blood. He had been left for dead by his own council, a fallen lion in the path of a hidden girl. As Pearl dragged his massive, armored frame toward the safety of the caves, she realized her exile wasn't an ending. It was a dark, necessary prologue. The ceremonial chalice lay in 100 jagged shards across the marble floor of the iron-bound pack house, the sacred wine staining the stone like a fresh wound. Pearl stared at her sister Terry, whose golden hair caught the moonlight as she pointed a trembling, accusatory finger. The accusation of poisoning the pack's well, the lifeblood of their people, rippled through the gathered wolves like a physical blow. Pearl tried to speak, but the words died in a throat constricted by a martyr's silence. She looked to the elders, seeing only the cold reflection of her own supposed guilt. In an instant, her title was stripped, her status as an Omega twisted into that of a traitor. The hunt began before the echoes of the sentence had even faded. Chased by those she once called family, Pearl ran toward the only place where the pack's scent trackers would lose her, the Forbidden Falls. The roar of the water grew to a deafening thunder, the mist rising like a ghostly shroud. At the cliff's jagged edge, she looked back one last time to see Terry's triumphant smile through the dark trees. Pearl didn't jump to her death. She vanished into the spray, her blue dress tattered as she slipped into the limestone caves behind the curtain of water. Weeks of isolation turned the soft Omega into a shadow. She survived on grit and ancient mountain lore until the night the river brought her a different kind of wreckage. Half submerged in the freezing pool was King Edward, the Alpha King of the Highlands, his golden armor caked in mud and blood. He had been left for dead by his own council, a fallen lion in the path of a hidden girl. As Pearl dragged his massive, armored frame toward the safety of the caves, she realized her exile wasn't an ending. It was a dark, necessary prologue. For weeks, the cave behind the Forbidden Falls served as a liminal sanctuary where the roar of the water drowned out the ghosts of Pearl's past. King Edward was a tempestuous patient, his recovery fueled by a volatile mix of Highland pride and a thirst for vengeance against the vulture council that had usurped his throne. Pearl, once the submissive martyr, found herself standing her ground against the man whose name was whispered with terror across the territories. She cleaned his deep, silver-laced wounds with mountain herbs, her steady hands a sharp contrast to the trembling girl who had fled the iron-bound pack. In the quiet hours between his bouts of fever, Edward watched her. He saw the way she painted haunting figures on the cave walls with charcoal and berry juice, depictions of a girl breaking through chains made of golden hair. He recognized that she wasn't just an Omega. She was a survivor who had mastered the art of becoming invisible to survive. He began to teach her the sovereign's decree, an ancient law that allowed a king to choose his consort based on soul strength rather than the biological lottery of a fated mate bond. The peace was shattered when the scent of iron and pine, the signature of Terry's elite trackers, drifted into the cave. Terry had not been content with Pearl's exile. She wanted proof of her death. As the trackers cornered Pearl near the ledge of the falls, Edward finally shifted into his massive, golden-maned wolf form. The violence was swift and absolute. The trackers didn't just die, they were erased. Standing over the wreckage, Edward looked at Pearl not with pity, but with a fierce, possessive intent. He didn't offer her a home, he offered her a war. Together, they began the arduous trek toward the Highland capital, a king and his chosen queen walking out of the mist to reclaim a world that had presumed them both dead. The ascent toward the Highland capital was a grueling transformation for Pearl. No longer shielded by the mist of the falls, she had to shed her martyr's skin to survive the high-altitude passes where Edward's enemies lay in wait. Edward did not coddle her. He treated her like a strategist in training, forcing her to find the hidden paths and hide their scent using the raw elements of the earth. Every step away from her old life was a step toward a cold, calculated power she had never dared to claim. The infiltration of Ironhaven was a descent into the dark heart of the kingdom. They navigated the rat-infested smuggling tunnels beneath the palace, the air thick with the smell of diesel and betrayal. When they finally emerged into the Great Hall, the atmosphere was heavy with the stench of the Vulture Council celebrating their stolen victory. Edward's return was a meteor strike of violence. He moved with the lethal grace of a predator, tearing through the elite guards as if they were made of wet paper. Pearl watched from the shadows of the balcony, witnessing the true, terrifying extent of the man she had saved. A king who did not tolerate traitors, and who snapped the lead usurper's neck with a single, brutal motion. With the throne reclaimed, the king's judgment turned toward the south. Edward's army, a terrifying force of 100 elite warriors, smashed through the borders of the iron-bound pack. Pearl stepped out of the lead armored vehicle, not as a broken Omega, but as a queen clad in black leather and silver thread. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the Butcher King, her gaze cold as she faced a trembling Terry and a desperate former fated mate. The sovereign's decree was invoked, shattering the biological lies Terry had woven. As her sister was dragged away to the unclaimed lands and her former mate was stripped of his rank, Pearl realized she didn't need the stars to write her destiny. She had written it herself in the blood of her enemies and the choice of a king. The aftermath of the king's judgment left the iron-bound pack in a state of shattered silence. Pearl stood in the center of the village square, her tattered blue dress replaced by the heavy, fur-lined mantle of the Highland court. Beside her, King Edward remained a towering pillar of iron and gold, his presence a silent threat to anyone who dared to remember Pearl as the mousy Omega. Terry lay at their feet, her golden hair tangled in the dirt, the alchemical glamour that had maintained her beauty finally flickering out to reveal a face twisted by the ugliness of her own envy. Pearl stepped forward, looking down at the sister who had once stolen her peace. There was no pity in Pearl's eyes, only the cold clarity of a woman who had survived the Forbidden Falls. When her former fated mate crawled toward her, babbling about the biological bond the moon had intended for them, Pearl did not flinch. She looked him in the eyes and invoked the power Edward had taught her in the dark of the caves. With a voice that carried the weight of the mountain, she formally rejected the bond, severing the ethereal thread with such finality that the man collapsed as if his very soul had been drained. The decree was absolute. Terry was banished to the unclaimed lands, destined to survive in the wild with nothing but the wits she had used to destroy others. As the Highland army prepared to march back to the mountain fortress, Edward took Pearl's hand, his thumb tracing the palm that had once nursed him back to life. They left the ruins of her old life behind, walking toward a future where her title was not given by birth, but chosen by a king. Pearl was no longer a fallen princess. She was the sovereign of the North, a queen who had found her throne behind the roar of a waterfall. The Highland capital of Ironhaven did not offer the soft comfort of the ironbound pack. It was a city of stone, steel, and vertical shadows that demanded the same resilience Pearl had found at the falls. As the newly crowned queen, Pearl no longer hid her pavement-colored eyes or her iron will. She stood atop the highest balcony of the mountain fortress, looking out over a kingdom that smelled of pine and victory, a stark contrast to the suffocating scent of betrayal she had left behind. The first winter ball of her reign was not a display of delicate silks, but a celebration of strength. Pearl moved through the great hall in a gown of midnight blue, her movements possessing the lethal grace Edward had helped her hone. When the Highland Alphas bowed to her, they didn't bow to a submissive Omega. They bowed to the woman who had dragged their king from the river and helped him burn down a rebellion. Edward stayed close, his presence a constant protective heat, proving that their union was a choice forged in the fires of survival rather than a biological compulsion. In the quiet moments after the festivities, they returned to the Solar, where a mural of the Forbidden Falls was carved into the hearth. Pearl looked at the image of the water and realized that her martyr complex had finally been replaced by a sovereign's pride. She had not just survived the theft of her life, she had built a more powerful one upon the ruins. As the snow began to fall over the highlands, the Queen of the North leaned into her king, finally home in a world she had claimed for herself. Years passed, but the legends of the queen who emerged from the mist only grew stronger in the Highland capital. Pearl sat in the royal war room, her fingers tracing a map of the territories she now commanded with a sharp, tactical mind that once lay dormant. She had outgrown the need for the iron-bound pack's validation. Her father's desperate letters, begging for Highland grain and protection, now sat unopened on the edge of her desk. She was no longer the sacrificial Omega, but the architect of a new northern alliance that valued resilience over the luck of a fated bond. One evening, King Edward entered her chambers, carrying a small, silk-wrapped bundle, his final gift to mark the anniversary of their meeting at the falls. Inside was a crown, not of traditional gold, but of polished limestone and raw sapphires, the exact color of the Forbidden Falls. It was a heavy, unyielding weight that represented the choice they had made together, a king who chose his own queen, and an Omega who chose her own worth. As he placed it on her head, the reflection in the glass showed a woman who no longer looked like a fallen princess, but a ruler who had survived the rod of betrayal to become a legend. The story of Pearl and Edward became the new foundation of Highland lore, a reminder that the strongest bonds are those forged in the cold dark of a cave and the heat of a shared battle. While Terry lived out her days as a nameless rogue in the unclaimed lands, Pearl stood at the center of a kingdom that breathed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. She had found her voice, and with it, she had built a throne that no sister's envy could ever touch. The silence of the war room was interrupted only by the crackle of the hearth as Pearl finally reached for the single, stained envelope at the bottom of the pile. It was from her father, Alpha Vance, no longer the commanding figure of her childhood, but a broken man presiding over a crumbling pack. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It begged for mercy, describing how the iron-bound pack had withered without her light, and how the neighboring territories were circling like scavengers. Pearl felt a flicker of the old martyr's pull, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold weight of the limestone crown on her brow. She did not write back. Instead, she summoned her messenger and sent a formal decree. The iron-bound pack was to be absorbed as a vassal state of the Highland Kingdom. They would have grain and protection, but they would no longer have a name or a seat at the council. It was the ultimate king's judgment, a restoration of order that turned her former tormentors into subjects. Her father would remain in his house, but he would do so under the shadow of the queen he had once allowed to be hunted into the mist. Edward found her standing by the window, watching the messenger depart into the snow. He didn't ask if she was sad. He knew that the woman who saved the king had no room left for the ghosts of small people. He simply wrapped his fur-lined cloak around her shoulders, pulling her back into the warmth of their shared reality. The girl who hid behind the falls was gone, and in her place stood a sovereign who knew that some debts could only be paid in the currency of silence and the absolute rule of a chosen queen. The legacy of the Highland Kingdom reached its zenith when Pearl and Edward stood together to welcome their first heir, a child born not of a predetermined prophecy, but of the strength and choice that had defined their reign. The birth was celebrated across the Northern Alliance, yet Pearl ensured the child's first introduction to the world was at the base of the Forbidden Falls. Standing where she had once been a hunted shadow, she held her successor toward the mist, a silent promise that this child would never have to beg for permission to exist or fear the envy of their own blood. As the years matured into a long peace, Pearl's transformation was complete. The fallen princess had become the architect of a new era, where Omegas were no longer viewed as submissive pawns, but as the potential heart of a kingdom's resilience. She established the Lunar Academy within the Highland Fortress, a place where those discarded by their packs could learn to harness their inner steel. She watched as hundreds of young wolves found their voices, ensuring that no girl would ever have to choose between a martyr's silence and a cliff's edge again. King Edward remained her fiercest protector and most loyal confidant, his golden mane graying, but his amber eyes still burning with the same possessive fire he had shown in the cave. Their love story, written in the ink of survival and the blood of justice, became the standard by which all Highland unions were measured. In the end, Pearl realized that the greatest victory wasn't the crown or the vassalage of her old pack. It was the quiet, absolute peace of knowing that she was exactly where she chose to be. The girl who hid behind the falls had finally stopped running, for she had become the mountain itself. The cycle of destiny came full circle when Pearl's daughter, Princess Alara, named as a reclamation of the name that had once haunted her mother's past, stood at the edge of the Forbidden Falls. Unlike Pearl, who had arrived there in tattered silk and tears, Alara stood in polished silver armor, a direct reflection of the Highland strength she had inherited. The iron-bound pack had long since faded into a footnote of history, a collection of humble villages serving the throne, yet the falls remained a place of power and pilgrimage. As the mist swirled around her, Alara discovered a young, wounded traveler washed up on the same rocky ledge where King Edward had once lay. Her guards moved to intercept, but she held up a gauntleted hand, sensing a familiar resonance in the air. The traveler was not a king, but a commoner from the lowlands, bearing a mark that suggested he had been cast out for a crime he did not commit. Remembering the stories of her mother's martyr complex and her father's sovereign decree, Alara realized that the true legacy of the Highlands was not just the crown, but the wisdom to recognize worth where others saw only wreckage. She did not seek a fated bond or a political alliance. She chose to extend the same mercy that had birthed a kingdom. Looking back toward the fortress where Pearl and Edward watched from the high balcony, Alara understood that the king's judgment was never truly finished. It was a living tradition of choosing one's own soul over the stars. With the roar of the falls as her witness, the princess reached down to help the stranger rise, ensuring that the story of the chosen queen would continue for generations to come, written in the ink of choice and the blood of the brave. The sun set over the Highland peaks, casting long, amber shadows across the stone halls of Iron Haven, where Pearl and Edward sat in the quiet of their twilight years. Their journey, once a frantic escape through the mist of the Forbidden Falls, had solidified into a reign that redefined the very laws of their world. They had moved beyond the need for war or vengeance, finding a profound peace in the knowledge that they had not merely survived the theft of their destinies, but had built a throne upon the ruins of the fated paths they were forced to abandon. Pearl looked down at her hands, no longer the trembling hands of a mousy Omega, but the steady, weathered hands of a sovereign who had turned her father's pack into a mere footnote of history. She had replaced her martyr's silence with a voice that commanded armies and saved kings. Beside her, Edward remained her anchor, the man who had looked past her designation to see a warrior's heart, proving that the strongest bond was always the one chosen in the dark. As they watched their daughter, Alara, lead the kingdom with the same fierce choice that had birthed it, Pearl realized that their story was the ultimate testament to resilience. They had proven that blood was not a cage, and that the stars did not hold the final say over a soul's worth. The girl who once hid behind the falls had not just found a king, she had found herself, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the highlands for as long as the water continued to thunder against the stone. In the final twilight of their reign, the legend of the Highland Queen and her Butcher King transitioned from contemporary history into the realm of timeless myth. Pearl spent her remaining days in the high gardens of Iron Haven, where the air was always crisp and tasted of the freedom she had first discovered in the damp limestone of the caves. She no longer wore the heavy furs of war, preferring simple, elegant silks that allowed her to move with the ease of a woman who had finally laid down her burdens. The resolution of her arc was found in the absolute silence of her old pack's memory. The iron-bound lands flourished under her Highland administration, but the names of those who had betrayed her, Terry and the weak, fated mate who had allowed her exile, were never spoken again. Pearl had successfully navigated her deep flaw, moving from a silent martyr who suffered for others to a sovereign who defined her own worth through her actions and her choice. She had transformed from an invisible Omega into the very pillar upon which the Northern Alliance stood. As the snow settled over the mountains for a final season, Pearl and Edward stood one last time at the balcony overlooking the kingdom they had reclaimed together. The story that had begun with a shattered chalice and a sister's theft ended with a kingdom of choice, proving that destiny is not a gift from the stars, but a prize won by those brave enough to survive the falls. Their journey was complete, leaving a legacy where every Omega in the Highlands knew they were born with the heart of a queen. The legend of the iron-bound pack and the Highland throne reached its final, enduring rest as the years crystallized into a golden age of peace. Pearl, once the discarded shadow of her sister, sat within the great archives of Iron Haven, overseeing the transcription of the Sovereign's Chronicles, a historical record that ensured the truth of her betrayal and rise would never be distorted by time or envy. She had successfully navigated her deep flaw, moving from a silent martyr who suffered for others to a sovereign who defined her own worth through her actions and her choice. The physical transformation of the kingdom was complete. The Forbidden Falls, once a place of fear and exile, had become the spiritual heart of the North, where young Omegas from across the territories traveled to learn the Sovereign's decree. Pearl had transformed from an invisible Omega into the very pillar upon which the Northern Alliance stood. The iron-bound lands flourished under her Highland administration, but the names of those who had betrayed her, Terry and the weak, fated mate who had allowed her exile, were never spoken again, effectively erased from the royal records. In her final days, Pearl stood one last time at the mountain's peak with Edward, the king who had looked past her designation to see a warrior's heart. Their journey, which began with a shattered chalice and a sister's theft, ended with a kingdom of choice, proving that destiny is not a gift from the stars, but a prize won by those brave enough to survive the falls. As she looked out over the vast, snow-covered highlands, Pearl realized she was no longer a fallen princess seeking shelter, but the very mountain itself, unyielding, powerful, and finally at peace. The story of Pearl and King Edward reaches its ultimate conclusion, cementing a legacy that redefined the power of choice over the constraints of destiny. Through the years, the Highland Kingdom flourished under their dual rule, transforming from a site of rebellion into a beacon of stability. Pearl successfully conquered her deep-seated martyr complex, evolving from a silent victim into a strategist who commanded the respect of the entire Northern Alliance. She ensured that the truth of her sister Terry's betrayal was preserved in the Sovereign's chronicles, serving as a permanent reminder that deception cannot outlast a heart of steel. The resolution of the Ironbound Pack's fate was absolute. They remained a vassal state, thriving under Highland protection, but stripped of the identity they had used to persecute Pearl. Terry and the former fated mate were erased from royal history, their names forgotten by a kingdom that now valued the Sovereign's decree, the law that a ruler may choose their partner based on strength rather than biological chance. In their final chapter, Pearl and Edward returned to the Forbidden Falls. Standing where the journey began, Pearl realized she was no longer the fallen princess who had disappeared into the mist. She was the architect of a new era, a woman who had saved a king, and in doing so, had claimed a throne that no envy could ever touch. As the snow fell over the highlands, the legend was complete. The girl who hid behind the falls had become the mountain herself. The final resolution of the Highland legacy saw the Sovereign's decree become the bedrock of a new societal order. Pearl's ultimate transformation was cemented as she stepped out of the shadow of her past and into the role of a legendary architect of peace. The Ironbound Pack, once the site of her deepest pain, remained a prosperous but nameless vassal state, its history of betrayal erased from official records to ensure Terry's envy would never have a foothold in the future. Pearl had fully overcome her martyr complex, replacing silent suffering with the authoritative voice of a queen who commanded the North with both mercy and iron. In their twilight, Pearl and Edward stood at the precipice of the Forbidden Falls, looking down at the ledge where their destinies had first collided. The fallen princess was no more. In her place stood a woman who had proven that biological fated bonds were nothing compared to a choice made in the dark of a cave and the heat of a shared battle. As the mist rose to meet them, the legend was finalized. Pearl had not just survived the falls, she had become the mountain.